So this is a fairly simple system here, based on two indicators, a short-term and a long-term indicator. So the short-term is a Gaussian indicator, and that is the green indicator here. And let's see, so Jeffrey's using 20 and 3 as his settings. And then the longer term indicator is the ADXVMA. And so that is the red and gray and blue indicator right there. Okay. So the ADXVMA is from lizardindicators.com, right? So that is the AMA, the AMA ADXVMA indicator on there. And let's pull this up. So let's see, lizardtrader.com. Lizard Trader, sorry, not Lizard Indicators, but lizardtrader.com. Well, actually, I think they also have a website called lizardindicator.com as well. So the ADXVMA is a part of their free library, which is a one-time membership fee. So it's not totally free, but there's a one-time membership cost. Same, just the exact same way as with Futures.io. There's a one-time membership fee if you want to download indicators off of Futures.io. So, all right, and let's see let's take a look at the other indicator, the Gaussian indicator here, the green one. So I was able to find that on, there we go. This is NinjaTrader's user app share, right, on NinjaTrader's ecosystem website. All right. And I just did a keyword for Gaussian in there. Just use the search term for Gaussian. And this is what came up here. So I already have this kind of ready there for you guys, right? So I just typed in Gaussian, and so it's the second indicator here, labeled Gaussian. So pretty straightforward, right? So you can download that indicator from NinjaTrader's app share website there, right? So let's see. All right, so that does it, right? Just two simple indicators there, a short term and a long term. So now the rules are, so to kind of summarize, basically the short term indicator is the one that's always submitting the trade direction, right? That's the one that's in control. So when the short term, reverses from going down to up, then execute a long trade. And then when the short term reverses from going up to down, then reverse direction to a short trade there, right? So the short term indicator, the Gaussian, is always in control of the trade direction, right? Now, if the short term and the long term indicator, if they disagree in any way, then just simply take a 10-tick profit. That's basically what it boils down to, right? So let's see here. So for example, let's see if we have some examples here. Yeah, here would be an example. So right here, it's kind of hard to tell, but the Gaussian does reverse up for at least one bar, and then it reverses back down again, right? And if we look up top, the longer term indicator is in a downward trend as well. So so right here would be an example of the short term and the long term in agreement there, right? But we can see here that a lot of times the short term, is reversing down or reversing up, and the longer term indicator, could be neutral. Right? So, so these would be just a bunch of 10-tick profit targets there. All right, yeah. So rule number 2, right? So as I circled here, when the short term and the long term are in agreement, then basically we're just going to go for the longer hold, as he puts it. He's just going to hold out for the longer run there, right? So in this case, right, when the short term reverses down, the longer term indicator is also in a downward trend, so there's no profit target. Just go for the longer run. Just stay in it for the longer run, and then you would take your profit when the shorter term reverses direction, right? So we can see the short term reverses direction. So you just simply reverse from a short trade to a long trade, right? And that would take the profit in that short trade. Now, every once in a while, you might be in a really long run like this, and I have a feeling, I'm missing data. That's why this happened here. All right, hold on a moment. Let's see if I can download that missing data. All right, here's an example, right? So the short-term indicator, right, reverses up. So we're in a long trade. And then we can see that the longer-term indicator, right, it does agree with the short term for a couple of bars. And then the long term goes neutral for a bar or two, right? So what do you do then? Because the short term and the long term are no longer in agreement, right? So if the longer term, stops agreeing, like we have circled right there, where the longer term, the ADXVMA goes neutral for a bar or two, then basically just default to rule number 1, which is check to see if there's 10 ticks of profit, and if there is, take it, and then you're out of the trade. So, and then also, also what's not mentioned in this shorter version here is that also in this situation here, if let's see here, here's a good example. So so ignore the circle for now. So we can see that the short term indicator, right, reversed down. So it probably grabbed 10 ticks of profit somewhere around in here, but the indicator is still going down, and then the longer term indicator goes down, right? It starts pointing down there. So let's see right there. There we go. So if you're flat, right, so if there's no position on, and then the longer term indicator starts to agree with the shorter term indicator, then jump back into a trade. Then get back into a trade, right? So rule number 1, right, will place a trade, but also rule number 2 will place a trade as well, right? So as soon as the short term and long term start to agree, then if there is no position on, then open a new position as well. So if you haven't figured it out already, pretty much this system is almost always has a position on, almost always, right? So with rule number 1, there might be a situation where there's short periods of time where there is no position on, but eventually, you can see that position is going to be put on fairly quickly here. All right, so with that, let's start building in BloodHound. First thing we want to do here is let's put a file name in. for our BloodHound system, and of course I just use the date. Alright, 21st. Get that. Alright, so once you have a file name, then you can start going to work. So let's switch over to the logic tab here so we can start working on the logic board here, and let's start a new. We need to create a logic template there by hitting the new button. And all right, so we're just going to call this the short-term and long-term system for short. All right, so this system is ultimately going to go into BlackBird, right? So this is going to be a two-part workshop. So we'll wrap it up in tomorrow's BlackBird workshop. So if we look at the system rules here, yeah, let's move that over, right? So BlackBird, is going to need a signal when the short-term indicator, right, changes direction, right? Because that's basically the controlling, right? This is the controlling indicator here, picking the ultimate direction. So, but then we also need, BlackBird also needs to know, when the short-term and long-term agree, in this particular case here. So, like for example, here, this might be a bad example, but, we can actually, here's a better example right there, right? So we had the longer term, we had the short term indicator reverse up, and it definitely looks like it would have gotten its 10 ticks of profit, right? And so, it'd be flat, but then we can see that the ADXVMA for 1 bar agrees with the short term indicator. So we get a 1 bar agreement, and so that would open a new position. But then the long term goes flat. So now the long term and the short term disagree, and so we would now default back to, rule number 1, which is, just grab 10 ticks of profit, if that occurs. So, all right, if that occurs. So, right. So there we go. So we need we need a discrete signal when the short term reverses direction. And we also need a discrete signal when the short-term and long-term are in agreement. So on those bars there. Yeah. So the short-term signal is going to be pretty darn easy, right, for the Gaussian indicator. So that's just a matter of using an inflection solver there, right? So every time your moving average reverses direction, right? That's the inflection point of that indicator. Those reversal points are inflection points. So we want to identify those reversal points. Okay, so we'll create a Gaussian inflection solver here. And so for the input, we're going to plug in the Gaussian indicator. All right, so we'll just have to scroll down to the G's. I'm not seeing the indicator. Let's see if it's in one of these folders here. Yeah, you know what? Oh, look at that. Lizard Trader also has a Gaussian indicator as well. So I might have to use that instead. Yeah, so there's something weird about the Gaussian indicator that it's not showing up on the list. Unless it shows up under a different name here. Ah, there we go. All right, that's probably it. AU Gaussian Filter. Let's see here. It has show paint bars and show plot. Yeah. Let's see here. So I'm using a 20 and 3 setting here. just open up this Gaussian indicator. Yeah, I don't see any properties here for the show plot and show paint bars. You know, programmers do funny things sometimes. So, all right. So I'm not positive that the AU indicator is the same as this Gaussian indicator that I have on my chart. So I don't want there to be any problems, you know, when people download this BloodHound file. So I'm going to remove that Gaussian indicator, and let's go with the lizard indicators Gaussian indicator, because I know there's not going to be any problems with that one. So there we go. All right, so we're going to use the lizard indicators Gaussian filter. So the AMA Gaussian filter indicator. So we'll switch that over. And let's see, it does default to 3 and 20. So perfect. Let me change the color here. So I'll switch that over to green. Make that a little thicker. There. All right. See, so they're the exact same formula. You know, couldn't even tell a difference between the two there. All right, so let's get BloodHound back open. Yeah, so as mentioned at the beginning of this question here, there is this Gaussian, right, on NinjaTrader's ecosystem here, but we're not using this Gaussian anymore since we're not exactly sure what the deal is with it. It wasn't showing up in the list as expected. So we're going with the Lizard Trader, you know, AMA Gaussian filter indicator, which is a part of their free indicator library, right? So both the indicators are coming from Lizard Trader now. All right, so both the ADXVMA and the Gaussian filter there. So, all right, so yeah, so instead of using this AU Gaussian filter, because I'm not positive that's the one that was coming from NinjaTrader, so we'll just use the one from Lizard Indicators. There we go. All right. So the Lizard Indicator one, yeah, just straightforward, a period and a pole setting. So there we go. So we have our inflection solver set up here. Let's go back over to the logic tab. There we go. All right, so with our inflection solver here, we can see whenever the Gaussian indicator reverses direction, right, at those inflection points, we now have discrete signals there at each reversal point or inflection point. So that's basically rule number one there, right? Real simple one. So now we need a discrete signal here for rule number 2. Right? Let's see here. All right, so I'm going to have to start making several logic templates here. All right, so here's our first logic template that's going to provide the, you know, the ST signal only. All right, and I'll make a copy of this. And let's see. Oh, try it one more time. There we go. All right, so now this will be the short-term and long-term signal there. All right, so there we go. So we have that. So now we need a signal when both the short-term and long-term agree with each other. So, yeah. All right, so I'm going to take a couple of slope solvers. Actually, no, maybe not. Maybe just one slope solver here. So, yeah, let's take a slope solver. And this is going to be the slope of the Gaussian indicator. All right, so let's get that plugged in there. Like so. So with the short term and the long term, right, we can kind of see that pretty much the short term, as the name implies, is always going to be, going in the direction of the longer term first, right? The short term is going to be picking the direction first, and then the longer term indicator catches up with it, right? So that's why I'm grabbing the slope of the short term indicator, because it's really it's kind of acting as a filter in a way, for the short term and long term signal together. Right? So now for the long term indicator, let's see here. We need some discrete signals, right? Whenever the ADXVMA, whenever it reverses, whenever it switches to a downtrend or switches to an uptrend, we need a discrete signal there. So let's see here. I think, we're going to grab another slope solver. So I think we can do that with the slope solver here. Yeah, it's either the slope solver or the inflection solver. So we'll experiment here and figure out which solver we need to use here. So, all right, so we need to go back into the Lizard Indicators folder. There's our ADXVMA. Now, our ADXVMA, we are using a 10 period, right? Because this is the longer term indicator. Now, instead of looking at the slope of the actual ADXVMA plot, which is what we see on the chart, we're going to look at this trend, which is a data series here, right? So just think of a data series as like a hidden plot, right? And normally you will need to go to the indicator developer and ask them, what type of data exists, in this data series called trend here. But in the case of Lizard indicators, a trend data series will almost always contain a +1 value, right, when the indicator is trending upwards, right? So in other words, when the ADXVMA is blue, it's in an uptrend. This is going to contain a +1. When the ADXVMA goes neutral, right, or in this case gray or gold, then the trend equals 0, right? Flat, no trend direction, 0. And then if the trend goes down, then the trend equals a -1 value, right? So it's +1, 0, or -1. And that's basically the simplest way that you can output a trend direction for your indicator, right? So if we look at this, right, we can see that, so when the ADXVMA goes from flat to an uptrend, we get a long signal. And then we can kind of see here, it went flat for a bar, and then it went down. Actually, sorry, hold on, it's not entirely true. Well, yeah, so here we can see it goes from flat to down. We have a short signal, but also we can see that when it goes from short to neutral, right? It's generating a long signal, right? And that's because it's, if we're using the slope. So, if when it's red, if that data series trend is a -1, and then it steps up to neutral, right? It's sloped up, going from -1 up to 0 for 1 bar, right? So you do get a slight upslope for 1 bar when you go from -1 up to 0. And the same thing occurs when you have an uptrend, right? The output is +1, so then you're at +1, and then you drop down to 0 for neutral. And so that creates a 1 bar, right, downward slope in the data. And so you get this short signal when the upslope goes neutral. So we need to get rid of these signals here when a trending direction, goes neutral, right? So we need to get rid of these neutral signals here from the slope solver. So, and let's see here. To do that, we're going to grab a threshold solver. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, what if we do the slope of the actual plot line, right? And, that's a good idea, but here's an example of why that doesn't always work. Depends on your indicator and how it was programmed. So if we stretch this out, so you see this little area here that's gray, right? But it's sloping upwards. So what do you think is going to happen if you put the plot line in a slope solver? Well, you're going to get an upward slope, even though the indicator is claiming to be neutral, right? So you're not going to get the same results as the indicator sometimes. So that's excuse me. So that's probably part of the reason why the lizard indicator, ADXVMA, has that data series trend, because sometimes the plot does slope up or downward, a little bit, but the indicator is in a neutral state. Right? So you just got to be aware of, these little, technical aspects of whatever indicator you're using there. All right, so with the threshold solver here, so we're going to plug in that Gaussian filter into the threshold solver. I'm sorry, not the Gaussian, the ADXVMA. Adjust the period. And once again, we're going to be using the trend output. And then, so for a long output, we want, right, we're looking for a value that's greater than 0. Right, so here we can see, right, when the ADXVMA is in a long trend, or basically when the plot turns blue, right? So another way of thinking about this is that this trend data series is telling you the color of the plot line, right? It's telling you the color there. So that's one way. This is one way that indicators can communicate its color to another indicator, right? Since indicator colors cannot be read with a NinjaTrader, right? That's not possible, at least not yet. Maybe NinjaTrader will make that possible, with NinjaTrader 9 in the future. But so far, you know, it's impossible for one indicator to read another indicator's color. Right. So the other way that an indicator can convey its color is to use something like this data series, you know, called trend. Right. So when that trend is +1, right, it's blue. The indicator is blue. When that trend equals a -1, that means the plot line is red. And when the trend equals 0, then that means the plot is gray color. Right? So for our threshold solver, right, we're looking for a positive one. So an output greater than 0 would be, right, +1. And so for the short output, we're just going to use less than E, right? So a -1 is going to be less than 0. So now we have a solver that's acting exactly like the slope solver, but it matches the indicator color exactly, right? So even though, right, the ADXVMA is sloping up, still there is no there is no long output when it's sloping up because it's gray, right? So we're effectively able to read the color of the indicator, right? Because the ADXVMA, you know, has this trend data series built into it. So, right? So there we go. So just to kind of look through here, right, we can see that the threshold solver's output, right, matches the color of the plot by using that data series trend output. Okay, so we have that, and so now if we combine the actual, right, so actually I should clarify these names here. Right, so we're actually looking at the slope of the trend output, right? And the same thing over here. For the threshold solver, we're looking at the trend output there. Right. So now, if we grab an AND node, right? So now when the ADXVMA, when it goes neutral, we now stripped out those signals in the opposite direction for when the ADXVMA goes into that neutral state, right? So remember, if we disconnect this, right? So it's going from a downtrend to neutral, and we have this long signal here. So we were able to strip out, right, those erroneous signals during the flat state by combining these two conditions together here. Right. So we're looking to to summarize this, right? We're looking at the slope of that trend output, and then we're also looking at the actual value of that trend output. So with the threshold solver, if that trend output is greater than 0, it's +1, right? We're getting a long output, getting a short output, right? So essentially, when the trend output is 0, right, then there is no output, right? When it's 0, there is no output. So in other words, when the indicator is neutral, right, there's no output from our threshold solver. And so that's what gets rid of the erroneous signals from the slope solver. All right, so now we have discrete signals from the ADXVMA, right? Whenever it starts trending, we get discrete signals there. So, All right, so now our let's take a step back here, right? Our purpose here on this logic template is to generate a signal when the short term and long term are in agreement, right? So we need to take our Gaussian slope indicator and let's see, I'm just trying to see if there's any examples here. Oh yeah, I'm sure this is probably pretty darn rare, but we can see it does happen where, right, where the Gaussian is in a downtrend, but the ADXVMA, blips up for 1 bar, right? So, normally you might think, well, the longer term indicator, the ADXVMA signals should be just fine, because they're always lagging behind the Gaussian. But we can see that every once in a great while, the longer term will give us a 1 bar kind of signal like this, going against the Gaussian indicator. So we do need this Gaussian slope, to act as a filter. So if I connect that in, there we go, right? So now when the ADXVMA, goes into a long trend, against the direction of the Gaussian, we now got rid of that signal there. There. Okay. So we'll drop that down there. Okay, there you go. Correct the name there. All right, so we have our longer term indicator, right, in 2 solvers up top. And then we have our shorter term Gaussian indicator acting as a filter down here. Okay, so these are the secondary signals, right? So the primary signals are coming from the short term indicator, right, the Gaussian, and then we have a secondary signal when the Gaussian and the ADXVMA are in agreement in the same direction, and then that'll generate a trade signal for BlackBird, right? So let's see here. Oh, so you know what? I had deleted the inflection solver here. Sorry. So remember the Gaussian inflection solver is our signals from the short-term indicator here, right? Every time it reverses direction. There we go. So we need to join these together here. Let's see here. All right. So we have the short-term and the long-term signals coming from the AND node, and then we have just the short-term signals only, from the Gaussian coming from this inflection solver. So now we need an OR node to combine both of those signals together. All right, so let's take a look on the chart here, right? So we can see we have a long signal here, right, coming from the Gaussian indicator. But then eventually the ADXVMA catches up, right? So if I connect this AND node into the OR node, there we go. So now there's that secondary signal when the longer term indicator, agrees with the shorter term indicator. So because if we look at this, right, a long signal, so we would have got into the trade, somewhere around here, and then somewhere probably on this bar, when the charts switch from this bar to the next bar over, is probably where the 10-tick profit would have been hit. So during the majority of this up bar, right, BlackBird would be flat. And during this down bar, BlackBird would be flat. And so then the longer term, agrees with the short term. And so we get a signal, and now once again we're right in the trade, right? So now we open up a long trade again. So, yeah, so this would be kind of a good example here of rule number 1 occurring first, and then right the 10-tick profit is taken, and then rule number 2 occurs, a couple bars later. And so we get another signal and jump back into the trade or open up another position. So, all right. Now, let's see here. So now we need to identify this situation here with 2A, where if the long term, stops agreeing. Well, we also need what BlackBird also needs, right, is BlackBird needs to know, well, are we in a short-term only, directional trade, in which case, we need to keep our 10-tick profit target, or are we in, a long-term and short-term trade, in which case there is no profit target taking, right? There is no profit target for rule number 2. You just, ride the trend out, right? So in which case you'd want to get rid of your 10-tick profit target, right? So BlackBird needs to be told, when this situation occurs here. BlackBird needs to know when the short term and the long term are in agreement. So let's see here. So let's adjust these names here. And I'll just put the word SIG in there, short for signal. So now we're going to need a third logic template here, so that BlackBird knows when the short-term and long-term agree, so that it can remove the profit target and just ride that trend out. Right? So let's see here. So for that, let's see. All right. So for that, let's make a copy of this logic template here, right? Because we basically need, all these bits and pieces here, to make an output. So we're going to make an output that tells us when the short term and long term agree with each other, right? So this is producing a discrete signal, but we need to know, the entire time when, when the two agree here. So let's make a copy of this. All right, so we're basically making an agreement type of output there. All right, so let's see here. So we need to get rid of the OR node because we're not combining two signals together. What we want to combine, let's see here. If we disconnect that, that should do it. Yeah. So, right, the short-term indicator is sloping down, and the ADXVMA long-term is in a downtrend. So when they both agree, we get a long output. And let's see, yep, so the ADXVMA goes into an uptrend for 1 bar, and the Gaussian is in an uptrend. So there you go. And once again, once the ADXVMA goes into an uptrend and the Gaussian is also sloping upward, and there we go. Yep, so that's all we needed. There, so I can get rid of that. Right, so this is going to tell BlackBird when the short-term and long-term indicators agree. So BlackBird will know if we're in basically, situation number 2, rule number 2 here. And if so, then we can use this output here, or we can use this logic template to tell BlackBird to get rid of the 10-tick profit target. And I think that's all the outputs that we need. Basically, all the different scenarios that this system creates here. I think we have them all built. Right, so if we take a look here, right, we have a short-term signal only. We now have a short-term and long-term signal only, and we also know when the short-term and the long-term agree with each other. Yeah. So there's our signals for the short-term Gaussian indicator there, reversing directions. All right, so that's rule number 1. And there's rule number 2. Well, it's actually it's rule number 1 and number 2. So so this is actually the one. So this logic template is the one that BlackBird is going to use to execute trades with, right? Because this both has rule number 1 and number 2, right? So all of the so these are both entry signals combined. Think of it that way, And then BlackBird's going to use the short-term and long-term, logic template to determine whether the profit target should remain or should be deleted, or canceled. Yep. So actually, I don't think we're actually going to use the short-term signal. I don't think that actually, it's probably not going to get used. All right, I think that does it. I think we have everything we need. The 2 logic templates there. So.